home. We have a little survey for folks to do as we wait for everyone to migrate from the waiting room into the actual presentation. So to give you something to do, if you want to go ahead and take a moment and just fill this out, our presenter is going to use some of this information in his talk here in a few minutes. For those of you who have never attended a Click Meeting webinar, if you have questions or need anything, you can type them in the chat box in the bottom right-hand screen. We'll do Q&A towards the end, but if you have anything super pressing, you can type them in there, and I'll do my best to fix it. We will get started in just a minute or two to give everyone a chance to fill out the survey and migrate over from the lobby. All right, we'll give everyone just another minute before we share the survey results. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started here in just a second. I hate to cut off anyone who is still filling out the survey. It's not super duper important, but just kind of a fun thing we're going to touch on later. I'm going to go ahead and end the voting and make the results live so everyone can see it. All right, and with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to this week's installment of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Alex Beal, the Public Programs Coordinator for Florida Humanities. Normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programming like this in person, but obviously that can't happen right now. Our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening in person once again. Next week, this program will be on July 8th at 6 p.m. and will feature author Pedro Medina Leon discussing the vice of 1980s Miami as portrayed in popular culture. You can register for this event on our Facebook page or on our website, floridahumanities.org. At the end of tonight's presentation, we have a very short survey. Before signing off, we would greatly appreciate you taking a moment to fill it out. If you have any questions for the speaker, please type them in the chat field in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and he will answer them at the end of the presentation. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Gordon M. Patterson, Professor of History at Florida Tech, where he has taught since 1981. In addition to his work at Florida Tech, he holds an appointment as a vector historian at the Center for Vector Biology at Rutgers University. In 2010, he received the Presidential Award from the American Mosquito Control Association, and in April 2014, he was invited to lead the Department of Molecular Biology and Immunology seminar at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. In March of 2018, Professor Patterson was invited to deliver the keynote address at the U.S. Department of Defense's triennial workshop on vector-borne diseases. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Gordon Patterson.
Thank you, Alex. It's an honor and a pleasure to get to spend a few minutes with 73 people that are interested in mosquitoes. The honor comes in part because the Florida Humanities Council is undoubtedly the single organization in the state of Florida that has done great work in presenting literature, history, philosophy, cultural studies to the people of Florida, the people of the Southeast, and the people of the United States. The pleasure comes from the fact that I get the opportunity to talk a little bit about six-legged blood-sucking pests. And tonight I'd like to focus upon the general theme of waging war on the mosquito menace in the context of its unique development in the state of Florida. Jeff Parker is a local, or was a local cartoonist in Melbourne, Florida. And this cartoon, in some sense, captures the magnitude of the problem that mosquitoes pose in the Sunshine State. Our state's development arguably would not have taken place without mosquito control. The magnitude of the problem and its origin is interesting. The first mention in literature of Florida came in 1568 when a Jesuit priest named Father Villarreal mentioned to his superior in Havana the pestiferous nature of what we would now think of as the Miami Beach area, asking to be returned to Cuba and taken away from this tropical hell in which mosquitoes were plaguing him. The first time the word mosquito, which comes from the Spanish word mosca, which means tiny, was used in English, came in Spencer's Faerie Queene in 1589. The number of mosquito species in the world is about 3,500. Each year, a different or perhaps a handful of species are identified. Florida currently has slightly more than 80 different species of mosquitoes. And around the world, mosquito-borne diseases have a toll of roughly 1 million people. Arguably, no creature on the face of this planet has ever killed as many of our species as mosquitoes. The story of mosquito control is, in some sense, in the numbers. A single female mosquito, theoretically, could produce 400 million progeny in the course of a year if only 25% of them survived. In the Everglades, scientists for what is now the Florida Medical Entomological Laboratory in Vero Beach conducted experiments in the 1950s in which they counted mosquitoes in pounds. 1 pound of mosquitoes is the equivalent of 1,095,000 mosquitoes. And in Brevard County, where I'm located today, on one of our barrier islands, a mosquito control commissioner named Lee Wenner went out and in a single square foot of soil found more than 12,000 eggs of Aedes taeniorhynchus mosquitoes, which would mean that if each one of those eggs came to fruition in an acre of land, roughly 516 million mosquitoes would be generated. These particular mosquitoes, they're pestiferous, Aedes taeniorhynchus, have been able to, or at least noted to have flown as far as 40 miles. In terms of American history, one of the striking things is that mosquitoes were a problem from the very beginning. William Bradford, when he sent back a message to his superiors in London about what kind of candidates should be chosen to come to the Massachusetts area, said that the people must be mosquito-proof because of the single complaint that was heard again and again by the colonists was that the mosquitoes were so much more fearsome and ferocious than their smaller English counterparts. In 1699, Jonathan Dickinson, who was coming up the coast of Florida in a ship called the Trinity, was shipwrecked off Jupiter Inlet. He came ashore with his wife and children and made his way up the coast to St. Augustine. On the way, the mosquitoes became so difficult that at night he and his family reported that they buried themselves in the sand to prevent the mosquitoes biting them. Mosquitoes almost prevented Florida from becoming a state. A Virginia congressman named John Randolph, shortly before Florida entered the Union in 1845, wrote, and I will quote him directly, that Florida is a land of swamps, of quagmires, of frogs and alligators and mosquitoes. Nothing good will come of it. Fortunately, John Randolph was not successful in his attempt to block Florida's statehood. But some of you, that small number of you that are native Floridians, know that our first flag in Florida had on it emblazoned the words, "Leave us alone." Some who dealt with Florida mosquitoes have argued that perhaps that was more directed at the mosquitoes than they were with their new American compatriots. To me, perhaps the most interesting description of mosquitoes comes from Zora Neale Hurston, who is arguably the finest writer in the 20th century, certainly in Florida, arguably in the United States. In 1929, Hurston had completed about a year's worth of collecting folklore around the state. And she came to part of what is now Melbourne, O'Galley, Florida, and rented a little cottage on the corner of Guava and Fifth Avenue. And there she composed her first important work, Mules and Men. And in it, she has a story, and I'll read it to you because it captures a sense of the nature of mosquitoes in Florida and our peculiar relationship with them. It's written in dialect, so allow me to use that dialect. Well, one Christmas time, God was going to Palooka, and the devil was in the neighborhood too, and he seen God a-going down the big road, so he jumped behind a stump and hid. Not that he was scared of God, but he wanted to get a Christmas gift out of God. And he didn't want to give God nothing. So he squatted down behind the stump till God came along. And then he jumped out and yelled, "Christmas gift, Christmas gift." And God just looked back over his shoulder and said, "Take the East Coast," and kept on walking. And that's why we got storms and skeeters. It's the devil's property. Now, we who live in zip code 666, the devil's property, have had a very striking relationship with them. In the pre-statehood period, that large area, which you see in the map in 1835, that's almost half the state of Florida, was a single county, simply called Mosquito County. It later became Volusia County, Brevard County, St. Lucie and Martin County, and part of Orange and Osceola County. This Mosquito County was an area which people feared to go to because of the presence of mosquitoes. One of the most interesting aspects of the story about mosquitoes is it was not until the 1880s that any medical textbook identified any disease that could be vectored by a mosquito. Mosquitoes were thought of in the prior to 1880 period as a pest, as a nuisance, as something that had to be put up with, but no one had any evidence that they actually produced diseases. Until in 1878, an Englishman named Patrick Manson, working in what is now Taiwan, discovered the relationship between mosquitoes and the nematode that causes the disease filariasis. In 1881, closer to Florida, a wonderful physician named Carlos Finley argued that a specific species of mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti, was responsible for vectoring yellow fever. Unfortunately, Finley was not able to replicate in an experimental setting the role of the mosquitoes. And his mistake was that yellow fever, when an Aedes aegypti mosquito takes a blood meal, it needs to take the blood meal in a person suffering from yellow fever, typically in the second and third day when the viremia is high enough within the person. The virus undergoes an internal incubation period that can last from 7 to 10 days in the mosquito, and then the mosquito becomes transmissive of the disease. In 1894, a young British Expeditionary Force medical doctor named Ronald Ross went to Manson's laboratory, learned about the role of mosquitoes with filariasis, and returned to India with a dissecting microscope and an interest in examining mosquitoes. And in 1897, on an August day, Ross discovered what was the clear evidence of the role of mosquitoes in the transmission of the plasmodium that causes malaria. That led to an explosion of interest. The American entry into the Spanish-American War in 1898, the occupation of a substantial part of Cuba, the outbreak of yellow fever in Tampa. More Americans died of typhus, typhoid, and yellow fever in the Spanish-American War than did in any combat with the Spanish, led the Surgeon General to establish a commission led by Walter Reed that conclusively demonstrated in 1900 the role that Carlos Finley had proposed 19 years earlier of Aedes aegypti mosquitoes transmitting the flavivirus that causes yellow fever. 1 year later, it was discovered that mosquitoes pass the virus we know as dengue. In short order, then, in 22 years, mosquitoes were identified as the causative agent in the transmission of diseases such as yellow fever, filariasis, dengue, and malaria. And suddenly, the interest in mosquito control became much greater. In Florida, this event was in some manner fueled by the work of this figure, Dr. Joseph Porter. Florida had had historically many yellow fever outbreaks. The coastal cities of Pensacola, of Jacksonville, and of Key West were decimated with yellow fever. Between 1867 and 1888, there were 9 yellow fever epidemics in Key West alone. In the summer of 1888, Porter happened to be in Jacksonville, Florida, when a colleague told him that a young man named R.D. McCormick had checked into a hotel and was feverish. Porter went to the hotel, examined McCormick, and discovered what he thought were the clear clinical signs that McCormick had yellow fever. At that point, Duval County, where Jacksonville is located, had about 25,000 residents. When news went out that yellow fever was present in the city, 10,000 people fled from the city. Shotgun quarantines were established around the city to prevent people from leaving the city because at that point in 1888, no one knew what caused the disease. In fact, one rumor was that it was something called fomites that rose up out of the soil, and that these fomites would cluster together and cause the disease, which led the auxiliary sanitary force in Jacksonville to assemble cannons, yes, cannons, and fire them off so as to break up the fomites. There's no evidence that a single mosquito was hit by a cannonball during this exercise, and there's no evidence that any mosquito was frightened by this. But at the end of 1888, Joseph Porter went to the Florida governor, who had been quarantined for 10 days, the typical quarantine after you were had malaria, you would, after you had been in an area which had yellow fever, you had a 10-day quarantine. They didn't realize that a 14-day quarantine would have been more useful. This is a quarantine pass for Miss Ava Cusman, which she had left Jacksonville and was coming back to it. What happens in 1889 is that Florida launches its own campaign for public health. In that year, 1889, Florida forms the State Board of Health. Porter initially was reluctant to accept the evidence that mosquitoes were responsible for the transmission of disease. By 1903, in what was the first circular that was published by the State Board of Health, mosquitoes were identified as disease vectors, and Florida began its campaign against mosquitoes. 2 years later, the assistant director of the State Board of Health, a man named Hiram Byrd, wrote the first entomological survey of mosquitoes in Florida. He identified 22 species, and in this very short survey, he makes what must have seemed to many the audacious claim that at some point in the future, mosquitoes will no longer be a problem. In 1905, the last yellow fever epidemic in Florida occurred in Pensacola. It was caused by tourists coming back from New Orleans on an excursion train. More than 500 people in Pensacola contracted yellow fever. 83 died. But what is striking about the 1905 yellow fever outbreak was that this was the first time that mosquito control played an integral role in suppressing the disease. The insect that causes or transmits yellow fever is the Aedes aegypti mosquito. It's what entomologists call a domestic mosquito, a container breeding mosquito. It ovipositions, deposits its eggs upon the narrow, moist margin between water and dry land. When water rises, it begins its process of moving through four instars. It's called domestic because this particular mosquito has become so adapted to living by human beings that it finds its preferred breeding places in coffee cans, gutters, receptacles that are left in yards that gather water. And so what happened in 1905 was that Porter directed health officers to cover cisterns, to dump water out, to inspect houses. And for the first time, a mosquito-borne disease in Florida was suppressed. Porter's campaign, I'm sorry, I went the wrong way. Porter's campaign gained a major advance when the state of Florida hired its first sanitary civil engineer. This man, George Simmons, came to the State Board of Health and began to do what science does best, and that is to observe and collect data. And in this period, Simmons saw the possibility that mosquito control through drainage could be used as a means to remove the nurseries in which mosquitoes breed. Unfortunately, a political event occurred, the 1916 election. The governor of Florida that was elected in 1916 was a man named Sidney Katz. Sidney Katz was a rabidly anti-Catholic figure. He wanted to order priests to turn down their collars, banning the presence of nuns. He thought that spending money on public health was a waste of time. And so he slashed by 25%, then by 50% the State Board of Health, because he thought that public health was a matter that was best left to individuals and not to the public. But what happened in 1917 was, of course, the United States entered the First World War. And that meant that Joseph Porter, who was unemployed as the State Board of Health Director, and George Simmons were drawn into a malaria control project outside Camp Johnson in Jacksonville, Florida. Florida in World War I was a place in which troops came to prepare. And when the inductees came, it began to be clear they were getting sick. And so what Simmons and Porter did was to create a kind of protection zone around Camp Johnson. The particular mosquito, they're called, the genera is called Anopheles. The particular mosquito in the American Southeast that is the vector of malaria is Anopheles quadrimaculatus. What is striking is that it has a flight range of about 1 mile, which means that what Porter and Simmons did was around Camp Johnson, they established a barrier zone of about 2 miles. And miraculously, there was no malaria outbreak at this camp. This became of singular importance for the Department of War and would have consequences in the Second World War. In 1920, in Perry, Florida, the Union Cypress Company was decimated by the presence of malaria in its workers. The State Board of Health, Sidney Katz was out, had come back into being, launched, along with the Union Cypress Company, a malaria control program by draining the areas around the cypress mill. The result was a dramatic improvement in the quality of life for those living in Florida. In the 1920s, it was dengue that caused the principal problem. We'll talk later. Dengue is back in Florida. There have been 10 cases of dengue in the Keys, Upper Keys, Key Largo. Just last week, the Florida State Board, the Department of Health issued a directive about that Monroe County is under a mosquito disease alert currently. In 1922, dengue was much more serious. The best estimate is along the Gulf from Texas through Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. In the summer of 1922, there were upwards of 200,000 cases of dengue. Dengue is also known as break bone fever. The reason it's called break bone is that it produces in those who encounter dengue a kind of agony in their joints and muscles that can last for weeks after their encounter with the disease that causes them to feel tremendous pain. In the Caribbean, in Jamaica, for instance, the disease was in the 19th century known as dandy disease, because people who had it for months would walk like dandies in a kind of stultified way. That outbreak led to the creation of organized mosquito control in Florida. And here, in some ways, we see one of the roles in which people at the grassroots make a fundamental difference. Women were integral to this project. The wife of the health officer in Jacksonville, the first woman mayor of Daytona, and Joseph Porter called for a meeting on the 7th of December in 1922 at the Palmetto House in Daytona. And about 150 mosquito warriors showed up, and they vowed to form an organization that they called the Florida Anti-Mosquito Association, with the express objective of winning the legislature and the governor's approval of the creation of mosquito abatement districts. It took 3 years, and in 1925, Governor Martin agreed to and signed into being a mosquito abatement law. And the first mosquito abatement district in Florida was the Indian River County Mosquito District, which has not only the distinction of being the first mosquito control district in the state of Florida, but it has the distinction, under the leadership of figures like John Beidler and now Doug Carlson, of being arguably one of the finest mosquito control districts in the United States, if not the world. Mosquito control suffered mightily, however, in the final years of the 1920s. The Great American Depression, like the tropical winds that come in the autumn, arrived in Florida much earlier than it did in the rest of the United States. By 1926, land prices, which had gone through a boom in the early 1920s, began to collapse. By 1928, the bottom seemed to have fallen out. And by 1929, Florida and the United States as a whole was in the beginning of what was to be the Great Depression. And during this period of the 1930s, mosquito control underwent a rather checkered existence. A checkered existence in that in 1933, it was proposed that there would be a new deal for mosquito control. In the winter of 1933-1934, when more than 25% of Americans were unemployed, the United States Congress and the federal government passed what was called the Civilian Works Administration, which put people to work in, quite literally, which were the first shovel-ready projects. One of those shovel-ready projects, which hired millions of individuals, was digging mosquito-controlled ditches. It only lasted for a short time, but the mischief was profound in that there was a separation between the entomologists and the engineers. Engineers like straight lines, and so the ditches were laid out in grid-like patterns. Mosquitoes and ponds don't necessarily lie in straight lines. And second, no money was put into the maintenance of the tens of thousands of miles of ditches that were dug. Here you see a picture of individuals digging one of those ditches in Florida. And the result of that was the ditches silted up, and we had created tens of thousands of miles of opportune locations for mosquito breeding. The story of what happens in the 1930s, in some sense, is redeemed at the end of the decade. By 1938, it was clear that a war was in the offing. Early in 1939, the Department of War began thinking about what that war would entail. And one of the things that was very clear was that it would require the training, if America entered World War II, millions of recruits. And much of that training would be done in the state of Florida. So an enterprise called the Malaria Control in War Areas was launched. It would eventually span the nation. But initially, it was particularly interested in the Southeast under the 4th Army Command based in Atlanta. And it established Army and Navy mosquito and malarial training programs. Again, Florida was at the foreground of that in a 3-stage program that began in Jacksonville, moved to Tallahassee, and then ended in Pensacola. In 1942, a quasi-secret laboratory in Orlando on Paramore Street, received on November 16th an interesting shipment from a military attaché in Basel, Switzerland. I'm going to show you a brief clip that was prepared by the Department of Defense. I'll mute myself so that we don't have feedback.
In anticipation of this, the nation's scientific resources had already been marshaled by the War Department to meet the challenge. Something new must be found to fight the menace of the disease-bearing insect, to take the place of insecticides no longer available because of the war. Through the National Research Council, this United States Department of Agriculture laboratory at Orlando, Florida, was one of the several places in which the work was centered. It was the job of this laboratory to raise the healthiest, sturdiest specimens of the common disease-bearing insects, and then to find the means of killing them. Hundreds of insecticides were tried out here, developed from materials sent in from all parts of the world. Some were fairly effective, even good. Compounds and solutions that dropped a mosquito in midair, could stun a louse, quickly dispatch a fly or a flea. But something better was needed, something that would kill all 4 insects and could be produced in the enormous quantities needed. If possible, something that might continue to kill, for a few hours anyway, or better, a few days after application. November 16, 1942, was the day that brought in a new insecticide sample from Switzerland. An accompanying letter gave some of the details. One feature sounded particularly interesting, if a little unbelievable. That was the claim that after a single application in a barn, this insecticide had continued to kill flies for a month thereafter. But scientists were accustomed to hearing exaggerated claims. The new material was given a code number and started along the testing routine. First, an elementary test against lice. A solution of the material is placed in a beaker, and the lice are added. Yes, it kills, but of course you can't catch all the lice in the world and put them in beakers. Now to apply it in powder form on the body of a volunteer. The lice are placed in a sleeve on the subject's arm. Another sleeve, which contains the standard Army delousing powder for purposes of comparison, is removed first. The results are as good as expected, with only a few lice surviving. Now for the other sleeve, dusted with the powder prepared from the new material. Results: every last louse dead.
The story of what happened at the Paramore Laboratory is a remarkable one. There are a lot of advantages to being an old man, but one of them was that I was able, when I was a younger man, to interview a number of individuals that worked at that Paramore laboratory and talk to them about the process by which they discovered that this remarkable material, which initially they called Gesseril, and then later the British supplied the three letters that we associate with it, DDT. And the tests were truly outstanding. The first place in the world that DDT was used against mosquitoes, both in the larval and adult stage, were the salt marshes around Cocoa Beach, Florida. And the kill ratio was extraordinary. 99.9% of those mosquitoes. A couple of men, an engineer named Husman and a pilot named Longcoy, developed a breaker bar that they put on a Stearman biplane that was then operating at the Banana River Naval Air Station and flew it over. A new generation of mosquito control developed. And the result of this was that by May of 1943, the Army quartermaster admitted DDT into the register of products that could be used against mosquito control, for mosquito control. And the high point in its first use came the following winter in 1943-44, when in Naples, Italy, after the Allied invasion of Sicily and moving into Italy itself, a typhus outbreak took place. Typhus has killed more soldiers from the time of Alexander the Great through Napoleon up to the World War I than probably any other disease. Lice are bred in circumstances in which hygiene is largely impossible. And what happened in December and January in Naples, Italy, was that DDT was instrumental in putting down that outbreak. The story of this, I'm going to go back and show another clip from a medical doctor speaking about DDT in 1945.
The War Department was quick to put the new substance into use in the field under the abbreviated name DDT. But let a medical officer tell you how effective it has proved.
DDT is the most powerful of the new weapons which the Army is now using in its war on the insect-borne diseases. The development of this weapon affords a spectacular example of the effective way in which all of the scientific agencies of this country have cooperated with the medical departments of the armed forces. Because we are armed with DDT, we no longer fear typhus fever. This chemical affords protection to American soldiers against the mosquitoes that carry malaria, yellow fever, dengue, and filariasis, and against the ever-present flies that spread certain filth diseases. DDT is now being used by the Army in all of our tropical theaters. However, there is still much to be learned about it, and therefore our research collaborators continue their investigations in the laboratory and in the field.
I think the operative phrase there is there's still much to be learned about it. DDT made a great difference in World War II. General MacArthur told Paul Russell, who was directing the anti-malaria work in the South Pacific, after Bougainville, an island which was taken by the Marines, that 1/3 of the Marines suffered from malaria, 1/3 were recovering, and 1/3 were combat ready. MacArthur said to Russell, this is going to be a very, very long war if we have to fight the Axis and the mosquito. Men like, well, there's a variety of individuals I could call upon that went out to fight against mosquitoes, walked with what are called dippers and Tommy guns on islands throughout the Pacific. My father was in the Coast Guard and was in New Guinea in the Philippines and took atabrine, which was an anti-malarial drug. He spoke with fondness for the time in which DDT came and put down the mosquito-borne diseases that were as threatening in some ways as their opponents on the battlefield. On the 1st of August in 1945, DDT was removed from the restricted production level by the War Production Board and was given over to civilian use. It's striking, though, that what happens in this period is that the United States was undergoing its own transformation. Initially, the fear of mosquito-borne diseases in the United States had been that our soldiers would go out and contract malaria or dengue or yellow fever. But by 1944, veterans were returning to the United States with malaria. And this led to a 180-degree shift in the malaria control in war areas to something that became known as the extended malaria control, with the idea of protecting civilian populations from the possibility of contracting malaria. On July 1st, 1946, the name for the Extended Malaria Control Program was changed to the Communicable Disease Center, the CDC. This is the foundational moment for what we know today as the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. In Florida, the state was resolute in its determination to build upon the accomplishments of World War II. In 1948, the State Board of Health initiated a campaign for the first time against pest mosquitoes, arguing that there was a monetary financial value in the possibility of vacationers and tourists coming to Florida. And in 1949, the state put $325,000 into mosquito control. I would contend that the golden age of mosquito control around Florida and in the United States was probably the 1950s. In 1953, in the state of Florida, a very important figure who was the chief entomologist for Florida, a man named John Mulrennan Sr., gave a speech to a group of Florida legislators in which he said, "Mosquito control is like a little watermelon seed. And if you give me enough money to buy that seed, I will transform this state." And what was interesting about Mulrennan's argument was that he said that the key to this was research. And so with what became known as state two funds, permanent control, not using chemicals, but permanent control of removing the areas in which the mosquitoes form and become adults. And the laboratory that was created out of this, it was called the Entomological Research Laboratory, was led by a man named Maurice Provost, one of the most remarkable figures in Florida entomology. Provost is instrumental in the formation of a host of new mosquito control districts. Unfortunately, DDT's magic properties were all too apparent. DDT was used against virtually every insect pest. And by the end of the 1950s, in fact, in 1948, the first resistant mosquito to DDT was identified in Florida, very near the place that the first DDT had been tested. DDT was used less and less against mosquitoes. I should say a word about resistance. Remember I said that when mosquitoes were first, encountered DDT, about 99.9 or 98% died. That small percentage that survived show resistance. And given the numbers that I showed you earlier and the magnitude of mosquito breeding, those numbers grow very much greater. I'm going to show you a clip now of the way in which DDT was described as a positive force. For those of you weak at heart, or if you're eating now, you may want to put aside your meal for a moment. I'll mute myself and you'll see this very short clip of children. This is clearly something that causes probably many of us to think about whether there were adults present, but there were. This is a typical kind of commercial that was out there. DDT is good for me. It's good for you. And you see in this picture a variety of ways in which DDT was used. This brings me to Rachel Carson, a speaker's personal statement. Rachel Carson is one of the heroes or heroines in my life. Rachel Carson was an amazing scientist. She was raised, she went to school in a small college, thought she'd major in English, but she had a woman zoology professor her sophomore year. And I suppose she had a kind of Saul Paul moment on the road to a career, and she became a biologist. She went to Woods Hole, worked there, and then got a job writing scripts for a Baltimore radio station about science, and then joined the U.S. Biological Survey that became the Fish and Wildlife Agency of the United States government. And there she rose to the head of publications. She wrote a couple of just amazing books. She was a marine biologist. In 1951, her work, The Sea Around Me, became a bestseller and was chosen by the Book of the Month Club. A speaker's aside. When I say that to my students, they look at me and their eyes roll, and I have to say to them, it would be very high up on your playlist on Spotify. And then they seem to get how important the Book of the Month Club was. Early on, Rachel Carson, was very, very interested in DDT and what was happening with it. And she received a letter in the mid-1950s from a woman living in Massachusetts adjacent to a wildlife preserve, where in the effort to treat Dutch elm disease, which was decimating the deciduous woods, the USDA was putting about 5 pounds of DDT on every tree. The result of that was the correspondent with Carson said that the bird population seemed to be declining. And so in June of 1962, the New Yorker magazine published the first of 3 installments for what would become, in September, a book we know today as Silent Spring. This book is arguably the beginning of the modern environmental movement in the United States. Carson was conversant with mosquito control. In later testimony, she said, I am not opposed to insect control. What I am opposed to is the Neanderthal use of chemicals against hosts of living creatures without knowing the consequences of that. The result of Carson's publishing that book led to an immediate backlash. The title of this article was Silent Spring is Now a Noisy Summer. The pesticide industry put $300,000 into a campaign to discredit Rachel Carson's findings. In October of 1962, 1 month after the book was published, in a press conference, President John Kennedy mentioned Rachel Carson and was asked if he or the government would look into this matter. And shortly thereafter, in the next year, a Senate committee convened and Rachel Carson testified before that committee. I found, I think it was 2 years ago, a letter that had been sent to the New Yorker magazine after the publication of those initial reports that became Silent Spring. Let me show you the way in which Rachel Carson was viewed by at least one reader from California. Miss Rachel Carson's reference to the selfishness of the insecticide manufacturers probably reflects her communist sympathies, like a lot of our writers these days. We can live without birds and animals, but as the current market slump shows, we cannot live without business. As for the insects, isn't it just like a woman to be scared to death of a few little bugs? As long as we have the H-bomb, everything will be okay. P.S. She's probably a peace nut, too. The vituperative words that were said about Rachel Carson are rather striking. In my looking at the arguments are emotionalism. She's not a scientist, that she was being influenced by sinister forces, and most fundamentally, she was a woman. And what should a woman have to say about these things? Well, when she was introduced to the Senate hearing, Senator Abraham Ribicoff said, quoting, of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So this is the little woman who caused so much, so much." And Rachel Carson did. There you see a picture of Rachel Carson, who was a frequent visitor to Florida, conducting some research down in the Florida Keys. The 1970s produced a series of challenges in Florida and around the country. In 1969, the State Board of Health disappeared. It became part of the Department of Health and Human Resources. By the 1970s, there was growing concern about the impounding of water and the draining of areas which had taken place in the high marshes along the coast. In 1980, Governor Graham convened a governor's working group on mosquito control to examine it in the state. And in 1983, a technical subcommittee on managed marshes formed to take on the question of the relationship of mosquito control to wetlands. This led to a variety of changes, which were very important. In 1984, the state of Florida conceived and instituted the Dodd Short Courses. This is an annual event which has transformed in many respects, not only mosquito control in Florida, but around the world, in which for a week people come together and study the science, the technology of mosquito control. They also go to Fort Myers, where aerial courses are conducted. By 1986, Chapter 388, which governs mosquito control, was rewritten, and in 1992, the entomological and public health interest of what had formerly been the State Board of Health become part of the Department of Agriculture and Human Resources. In 2001, an event occurred which again galvanized public opinion. This is the cover of a New Yorker magazine, which shows a mosquito and some birds. Birds are part of the biological rhythm of our continent and of the world. And the migratory patterns of birds are very instructive. West Nile arrived in New York City in the summer of 2001. It arrives, in 1999. It arrives in Florida 2 years later in 2001. And it came via the birds. The birds brought the virus. The mosquitoes that fed upon those birds will occasionally feed upon human beings, and we had our first cases of West Nile. This produced a set of changes in mosquito control, which I think will only grow more pronounced in the 21st century. Disease ecology, the relationship of human beings and viruses and insects and animals, is something that we've learned a lot about since March 2020. Global warming, exploding population, urbanization, the movement of species that formerly inhabited one part of the world coming to another, and finally, emerging pathogens, new diseases which we've not encountered before, like COVID-19, offer profound challenges to the public's health. Zika in 2016 is perhaps the example that most of us became aware of. The story of Zika is very briefly told. In 1947, entomologist, a medical doctor named Alex Hadow was stationed outside of Entebbe, Uganda, near Lake Victoria. There's a tower there, and there he put a rhesus monkey, I believe it was rhesus monkey 18, on the 19th of April in 1947. Climbed the tower the next day, monkey seemed okay. Climbed it the next day, monkey had a fever. And in 1947, the Zika virus was discovered. It was 5 years before a human case of Zika was identified. And then between 1952 and 2007, there were only 14 clinically identified cases of Zika on the planet. And then in 2007, in Micronesia, on Yap Island, 73% of the population showed positive for an encounter with Zika. What had happened, of course, is that like birds, human beings take wings, and by tourism and travel and airplanes and our own patterns of behavior, we had become the biological magnifiers of this disease. In 2008, it appeared in French Polynesia, 2015 in Brazil, and in 2016, there were 1.5 million cases of Zika in Brazil, and by 2019, there would be cases of Zika, about 130 cases in the Miami-Dade area of Florida. This clearly represents the way in which diseases move around the world. This map shows you the area in purple is the area of the world in which the mosquito that is the principal vector of Zika, of dengue, of yellow fever, that container domestic mosquito, Aedes aegypti, where it lives. Roughly 3.5 billion people live in that area. And the consequence of this means that the vector is present, the viruses are present, and without robust responses, the patients and the disease toll is something that is likely to grow. The era that we've entered into now, I would argue, is the era of biological control. Mosquito control districts, organized mosquito control districts, do not want to use chemicals. They would prefer to not allow mosquitoes to breed. So permanent control is what is sought for. But beginning in the 1970s, 1972 is when DDT was banned in the United States, a series of biorational pesticides appeared. The first was in 1975-76, BTI, Bacillus thuringius israelis, a group of Israeli researchers in the Negev desert found an oasis in which there were no mosquitoes, and this seemed impossible. And what they discovered was that this bacteria, which appears in nature, has a very interesting consequence for mosquitoes if it's introduced into their larval stage, that they will not pupate. And so BTI becomes a way in which mosquitoes can be prevented from becoming adults. And many of you probably have seen women and men, technicians, putting tablets or briquettes into water adjacent to your home. That is to kill the mosquitoes. Shortly thereafter, methoprene, which is an insect growth regulator that prevents the insect to move through the four instars before pupation occurs. Wolbachia, another very important. The Australians have done pioneering work with Wolbachia. 60% of insects have Wolbachia present in them. So this is not something new in nature. The cockroach, the palmetto bug that you see running through your house and probably frightens your dog or cat has Wolbachia in it. The problem for Aedes aegypti mosquitoes is they don't. And if a male Aedes aegypti mosquito is introduced to Wolbachia and it mates with a female, the female becomes cytoplasmic, meaning that her eggs are produced and they're sterile. So this is a very interesting way to reduce the challenge that mosquitoes poses. We've entered, however, in the last 10 years into a new era in terms of the way in which the DNA of mosquitoes can be altered. In 2009, Oxitec, which was a spin-off, a company from a group of researchers at Oxford, began working in conjunction with the Keys Mosquito Control District in Monroe County. They hoped to introduce a mosquito, a genetically altered mosquito known as OX513A. 2 bits of protein changed. 1 bit of protein was there that would cause the female mosquitoes to produce sterile eggs, and the other was a marker that could be identified. I'm going to play you another clip. This is from KQED. It's a bit longer, but it's quite useful. And then we're going to talk about what happened in 2016 and what's happening in 2020.
The beginning of summer. Longer days, warmer weather, and mosquitoes. If you're anything like me, or really any normal person on this planet, you hate mosquitoes and their nasty little bites. Mosquitoes are no joke. Worldwide, malaria alone kills over 400,000 people a year. While in the US, we don't have to worry about malaria anymore, mosquitoes can still spread West Nile, dengue fever, chikungunya, and most recently, Zika. So managing these flying Grim Reapers is a big deal. There are even whole government agencies dedicated to keeping them in check. It's usually an all hands on deck type of situation where we just throw everything at them. We turn over buckets to reduce water breeding grounds, we spray pesticides, we release soil bacteria to kill their eggs, and we even drop mosquito larvae-eating fish into the water where they can breed. And now, some scientists are even taking it to the next level and going after the mosquito's DNA. The British company Oxitec has come up with a new weapon against these tiny tormentors. It's none other than genetically modified versions of the mosquitoes themselves. They've been engineered to carry a gene that causes the mosquitoes to produce too much of a certain protein, which ends up killing them. So for the first time in the US, scientists are itching to release these mutant mosquitoes for a trial run in everyone's favorite state to hate, Florida. I'm just playing. I got love for Florida. One of our producers is from there. Hi guys. The scientists are looking at Monroe County, this little section of paradise, and more specifically, Key Haven. This place is home to over 40 different species of mosquitoes, and the residents here are divided on the trial. While the media covered the pros and cons of this approach, a small but vocal group kept bugging out in a lot of the media coverage.
We don't have enough risk assessment.
We don't want to be lab rats.
We are humans and we don't like being treated like guinea pigs.
So how risky are these mutant mosquitoes really? All right, so the species we're talking about is the Aedes aegypti. They're the ones that carry Zika, chikungunya, and dengue fever. Originally from Africa, they're invasive to Florida. And these guys are nasty. Well, it's actually not the guys. It's the ladies who are the nasty ones. They're the ones that bite you, spread diseases, and reproduce like crazy. And while these little buggers make up only a small percentage of the mosquitoes in the Florida Keys, they're really hard to control. They thrive in residential areas, that makes it easier to bite people, and they can breed in the littlest bits of water. For the trial, the plan is to release the modified males into the wild. Remember, the guys don't bite. They'll mate with the wild ladies. Then in a couple days, they'll die. But before they do, they'll pass that killer gene onto their babies. Once those babies hatch, they'll die before they even become adults, so they don't even get the chance to reproduce. I just wanted to say that's like the saddest line I've ever read in Above the Noise history. So that sounds good in theory, right? But does it work? Oxitec has done a couple of trials in Brazil, Panama, and the Cayman Islands, which ended up reducing the mosquito populations. And it's not just the company saying this. Their results are published in a peer-reviewed science journal, which means outside scientists have looked at the data and given it the thumbs up. We talk about peer-reviewed journals in this video right up in there. But what about the risk from the mosquitoes? Well, I'm glad I asked. Before this goes to trial, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has to give it the okay. They concluded that releasing these modified mosquitoes in Key Haven would not harm people, other animals, or the environment. And in case you were wondering, they ruled out the possibility of these mutant mosquitoes passing their modified DNA to humans. You can read the whole 158-page report. There's a link in the description. But there's still some people who are against the trial. Critics want more peer-reviewed research before exposing the public to this experiment, and some advocacy groups like Friends of the Earth and Center for Food Safety have even threatened to sue the FDA. They claim the FDA didn't do a good enough job weighing all the risks, especially the impact the mosquitoes could have on threatened and endangered species. And then there are others who have ethical concerns. They think we should not be messing with the DNA of animals, period. Okay, so if the FDA says it's safe, but a group of people in the community aren't happy about it, what do you do? Well, the Florida Keys Mosquito Control District decided, ask the voters. They put 2 measures on the ballot. One for all of Monroe County, asking if in general people are in favor of a trial somewhere in the county, and another measure just for Key Haven. Monroe County residents voted yes, while Key Haven residents voted no. So Key Haven is out. Now Oxitec and the Mosquito Control District are looking for a new location for the trial in Monroe County, and they'll have to go through the approval process all over again. This means no modified mosquitoes anytime soon. But this has raised some really interesting questions. How do we know when a new public health technology is safe? How would you weigh potential risk of the modified mosquitoes versus the risk of getting a mosquito-borne disease? Let us know in the comments below.
Well, the story that young man presented was quite good when he said it's not going to happen anytime soon. Well, this is soon. On the 1st of May of this year, the Environmental Protection Agency issued an experimental use permit for the 2nd generation of Oxitec's modified mosquitoes. As the presenter said, in the election that took the non-binding election 2016, 58% of the people in Monroe County as a whole said they had no opposition to the use of genetically modified mosquitoes, while 65% in Key Haven opposed it. Well, on the 1st of May, this new mosquito, XI5034, received a permit, or at least Oxitec, a 2-year permit. Now, one of the interesting things about this is the regulatory bodies controlling genetically modified insects, or in general, have moved from, in the early 2000s, it was the USDA, and then it became the FDA, and now it's the EPA. And in a sense, the question that the presenter asked about how do we assess the use of a technology, I put a link here for you to the Oxitec website. And you might want to copy it down and look at it, because it publishes all of the documents that went into this. By now, there have been more than 200 peer-reviewed publications discussing the Oxitec experiment. The outrage of many against this is palpable. A week ago yesterday, I took part in a 3-hour meeting that the Keys Mosquito Control Commission organized with Oxitec, in which people in Monroe County and around the country, in fact, talked about this pending experiment. There'll be another workshop later this summer. And the key is that people are very divided about this. And there is, as the presenter said, a rather vocal minority who is speaking out very strongly. I will share with you one of the things. There were 31,000 comments in the EPA solicitation of comments to the permit. Of those, 56 were positive and the remainder were negative. That's pretty devastating, but then you look through them and you find that in many instances you have 5,000 or 6,000 identical letters being sent from individuals, which suggests that there's an organized opposition. But one of the things that was striking me when I read through these was, on a number of occasions, the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal was cited as the reason, that the Monroe County Mosquito Control should not do this. And that didn't at first make sense to me, but just a bit ago in the town I live in, Melbourne, Florida, there was a rather strident controversy in the Melbourne City Council about fluoridation of drinking water. And I went to the meeting because I'm interested in, as a citizen in events like this. And again, the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal came up, which made me wonder where this came from. We'll find out what happens with this in a short time. It might be useful now, Alex, if you put that poll up there for a second, and we'll come back to it at the end. Not that poll, the poll, there we are. Let's imagine, this is the text that was for the 2016 non-binding. As citizens, how would you vote now about the release of genetically modified mosquitoes? Okay, Alex, you want to close that? We'll go back to my slides for a second. We'll come back to the results. Here's another one of Jeff Parker's slides. You know, the best advice I can give you, people like Dave Brown and others out in California. Dave Brown is the technical advisor for the American Mosquito Control Association, is don't get bit. Repellents, wear clothing, don't go out at times when mosquitoes are biting. That's a safe way in which you can protect yourself. What are the lessons of history? Well, mosquito control has accomplished a great deal. The elimination in America of yellow fever, the removal of malaria. America was a country that had a high malaria rate in the 20th century, at least first half of it. The significant reduction of dengue fever. We've had great success as well in reducing the impact of pest mosquitoes. But on the other hand, we've grown apathetic about our relationship with mosquitoes in the natural world. And as 2016 showed us, when Zika appeared, there can be hysteria in people and the fear of what can happen. Maury Provo, the figure that led the entomological research laboratory of the Florida State Board of Health, said something in an essay. He was very much, his roommate at Berkeley was Aldo Leopold's son. Provo knew Rachel Carson. He observed, the day is gone when we can improve our relations with fellow man or fellow animals by simply reaching for a gun. We need to understand, and for this we must learn. And so we need only learn and learn and learn some more to appreciate our natural environment is full of wonder and beauty, even if we learn about some practical phenomena as the common milieu of birds, mosquitoes, and viruses. The phrase in this spring and summer of our viral discontent, the phrase that I've heard so much is we are all in this together. And from chimpanzees to orangutans, elephants to giraffes, and yes, human beings and mosquitoes, we're all connected together, as Rachel Carson pointed out, in a web of life. Mosquitoes pose a serious challenge. They've killed more human beings than any other creature on this planet. Organized mosquito control has done, in my judgment, a remarkable bit of work in reducing the peril that mosquitoes have presented us. These two quotations I've thought about a lot in my own work. One's from Sun Tzu's Art of War. He who knows the enemy and himself will never in 100 battles be at risk. And a final observation from Maury Provo. Man alters everything he touches, but luckily he doesn't touch everything. Final quotation from a book my mother used to read to me when I was a boy, and I fear that he's right. E.B. White, Charlotte's Web. People are not as smart as bugs. There are more of them than us. We've got to get smarter, become more sentient, more careful. So that brings my thoughts together. I've seen some questions that are out there. I was interested. Thank you, Alex. Most of you are from out of Florida, so you've come to Florida and you found your bit of paradise. We see here that 34, say give it a try, 6, that's interesting. I've seen some questions coming up in the chat box. I've tried to look at it on the side of my eye. We'll come back to the GMO mosquitoes if you'd like to. One person asked about sentinel chickens. Many mosquito control districts use flocks of sentinel chickens that they place strategically around areas of concern. They then draw blood from those chickens periodically and run an ELISA test on the chicken to see if there are antibodies present for any of a host of diseases. This is a very effective way. You don't want to blanket an area with a chemical when there's a hot spot that's important. Currently in the Keys, there have been 10 cases, as I think I mentioned, of dengue fever. The majority of those cases, 7 of the most recent ones, are in a 3-block area of Key Largo, Florida. That's good science. We know where the disease is. We know where the mosquitoes are. These Aedes aegypti mosquitoes don't fly much more than 200 or 300 feet. So out you go, you turn over water around houses, you public information, you get citizens alert. You can do that. Sentinel chickens are very important. As a professor, I will share with you this. One of the great pleasures of being a professor is when you have a student get a job. And one of my pleasures was I had parents of one of my students come up to me and thank me upon this young man's graduation that I had secured for him a job bleeding sentinel chickens as working for a local mosquito control district. I felt good about that. I'm glad he had a job, but I never thought in my academic career someone would thank me for bothering chickens. Unfortunately, funds have been cut back in this budget time, and many districts have had to sell their flocks of chickens because of financial crises in our time. So that's there. Let's see, anything else? Alex, do you have some questions that came up?
I'll go back and look, but before I do that, I just wanted to let everyone know I put up the kind of general program survey. If before you sign off tonight, if you take a second to fill it out, we'd very much appreciate it.
Well, I'll scroll. Can I scroll back, Alex, through these?
Yeah, you should be able to scroll back up. There were a few questions earlier in the presentation. I don't know, you might have already answered them kind of as you went.
I'm looking at this. I'll give it a quick. Yeah, I guess these programs are archived, yes?
Yeah, so if you missed the beginning part of it, or if you want to share this event with friends or family who could not tune in live, we make these available on our website, and I put the link in the comments here. But it's on our website, floridahumanities.org. This presentation will be available sometime tomorrow. I don't know exactly when. And all of the events that we have permission to share are available there for some amount of time. Some presenters allow us to leave it there indefinitely. Some presenters only for a certain amount of times. But we have a handful of presentations that we've done there, and this one will be added sometime tomorrow.
I see a couple of questions. One said that an individual spent a bit of time in Peru and in the Amazon area and had friends that went there. That's an interesting area. I was down in Ecuador in the Amazon last year, and I thought about it because yellow fever is now present in the Amazon area. Yellow fever is a flavovirus. You either get well or you don't. You can symptomatic, you can try to reduce the fever, but your body's either going to throw it off or you're going to die. Not everybody dies. The numbers fluctuate. Perhaps, I don't know, I've seen as high as 24% of the people. So it's a serious disease. The first vaccine, virus vaccine, that was developed was in the 1930s, and it was against yellow fever. And that vaccine has been a staple up to the present. I had a yellow fever vaccine when I was working in the Middle East in the 1970s. At that time, the World Health Organization said it was good for 10 years. 2 or 3 years ago, the WHO said it's good for a lifetime. I'm not sure. I worried a little bit when I was in the Amazon, and a Russian asked me, when a Russian asked an American advice, I think, wait, do they think I'll get yellow fever? And I said, I don't know. What about our elections? He didn't have an answer on that. But the yellow fever is there. It's a serious disease. It's also now, I was in Tanzania in December and January, and in the Congo, which I was not in, there's yellow fever. So you want to watch out. That said about it, there is pretty good evidence that if you're over 55, you don't want to get the yellow fever vaccine because it does produce some unpleasant immune responses that can be life changing, that they'll last. I was with an Australian who was in his 60s, and he'd had a yellow fever. Again, this is a couple of years ago, and he was still feeling some discomfort from that. He surmised, I'm not a medical doctor or a scientist, that it came from that disease. I mentioned the sentinel chickens. Should we be taking antimalarial drugs? Well, it depends. Not here in Florida, for heaven's sakes. No, the last case of malaria that was really significant was in 1948. There was an outbreak of malaria in 1995 in Palm Beach County, and then in a couple of cases in homeless camps, which nobody's figured out how they came about in the early 2000s. But malaria is really quite rare not present here. Some parts of the world is very serious. The anti-malarial drugs have their positives and their negatives. They can disrupt your sleep, produce pretty strong dreams. The Anopheline mosquitoes in America, well, the one in Africa, Anopheles gambiae, is a mosquito that feeds at sunset in the hour and a half to 2 hours after sunset and at dawn. So what's called cultural steps. Just don't go outside then. Don't sit on the veranda in your swimsuit if you're at some resort in Mombasa or in Victoria, off Lake Victoria. You can prevent that. Wear repellent. There are now, I recommend to people, there are pyrethroid treated clothing, which one of the reasons I was speaking to the Armed Forces Pest Management Board as part of the war fighters legislation that came out after 9/11 is we've sent an awful lot of service people around the world where insects are a problem. And the military has developed some very effective clothing that up to 75 washes have effective repellents in them, long sleeve shirts. There are a variety of commercial clothing companies that sell these, REI and others, Campmore, you can buy it, and they're very effective. And you can also buy sprays of this and spray your own clothes with that. I have not seen in the literature any adverse allergenic effects upon anyone. It certainly hasn't bothered me. That's a good thing to do. Can you speak about Dr. Seuss? Yes, Dr. Seuss was very much the wartime Dr. Seuss did some great cartoons. The one cartoon in there was not from Dr. Seuss, but he wrote a really sweet book about malaria, which you can find on the web. And if you want, I believe it's in the public domain. Walt Disney got involved in making a film in which the seven dwarfs and Cinderella get involved in mosquito control, and that's very fun. I mean, they're out there and they're putting up screens and they're with their flit guns. I mean, it's the seven dwarfs as public health workers. I was interested in my getting opportunities to meet people. I wanted to find out how many of you might have run behind a mosquito fogging truck. They're called thermal foggers, spraying out the insecticide. Many people did. It's always interesting to me. I never done that, but one of the things I interviewed many years ago, a man named Don Wheathouse, who was instrumental in the early USDA Paramore laboratory work. And he told me a story about his daughter coming back and saying that she wasn't able to run by the truck because her eyes were burning. And that must have been in the late 1950s, because by that point, by 55, 56, we were not using DDT in Florida in mosquito control. That stopped. They were using organophosphates, one called malathion. And malathion did cause his daughter's eyes to burn. So if your eyes burned, if they didn't burn, then they burned, you've been exposed both to DDT and organophosphate. But you're a winner. You're still here. So good. My wife ran behind the truck, and she's a vibrant person. So there's no thing to worry about.
Someone asked what chemicals they spray today with the trucks and the aerial spraying.
There's some OPs. Many of the trucks are putting out BTI, which is a biorational, or methoprene. There's a limited number of insecticides out there. In some sense, the EPA, which authorizes the use of insecticides, has placed very stringent rules, and the number of chemicals that can be used is a very narrow one. And this is something, if you have nothing better to do tonight, go under your sink and pull out a can of insecticide and turn it around and look at the label. That label is the law, and it explains to you how you should use that insecticide. Should it be used near water? Should it be used in, organized mosquito control is scrupulous about following the label. And they're also scrupulous about, you just don't go out and spray when there's one mosquito. One of the reasons, you've got to know that there's a disease out there. That's why the sentinels are important. They also use light traps, CDC light traps, or an ancestor called the New Jersey light trap. And there's a certain count level that has to be present of female mosquitoes before you can do anything. And that's the science of mosquito control. I heard someone earlier this morning complaining that mosquito control was not out doing. Well, there's probably a reason for that the mosquitoes could be very intense in this person's backyard, but it doesn't warrant an action against mosquitoes as a whole. There are, in a free economy, private enterprises that promise mosquito control, barriers and things. And I don't want to get sued by them, but let's just say mosquitoes migrate, and there's no way you can build a wall. And if you kill all the mosquitoes in your backyard, your neighbor's mosquitoes will say, wow, there's supper, and they'll come into your house. So it might be effective for a few minutes or a little while, but the mosquitoes will come back. Let's see, anything else? Someone spoke poetically, the little bastards are everywhere. I've been attacked by them in Alaska. Yes, Alaska is a very interesting case. Alaska is the only place that we've been able to document the migratory patterns of large mammals, caribou, caused by these broods of mosquitoes that rise up. And the reason for that is mosquitoes, when they oviposition, the eggs will not begin their 4 instars unless the temperature is above about 75 degrees. And in Alaska, there's a very limited window, and the eggs will overwinter. So you may have 1 trillion mosquito eggs out on the ground. It rains, the snow melts, temperature goes up to 75, and you have a brood of mosquitoes, and the caribou, they take off. And that's a very interesting phenomenon. It's only equaled by Gordon Patterson moving away from his backyard when the mosquitoes begin to take flight, the Taeniorhynchus or solicitans, and move me indoors. And one of the things that's also interesting, the old standard, for those of you who want to get out and do this, of mosquito control was a LPM, landings per minute. And it referred to from your elbow to your fist, how many mosquitoes would land in a minute, and that count. And I saw documentation, and this really shows somebody who A, had a strongly disciplined temperament, and B, extraordinary mathematical skills. I saw an LPM that somebody in Volusia County got of 453 landings in a minute. That's an amazing ability to count mosquitoes. Think about that. Bite your tongue. At least I do when I think about that sort of thing. I'll end on this note. This will, something that will, again, you can dine out on. Florida has the distinction of having more upscale nudist camps than any other state in the United States. And in part of my research, it's not yet come to fruition because I've been taking my clothes off and gone. I've been interested in the way in which nudist camps respond to mosquitoes. And it turns out all good things go to Orlando. The World Archive for Nudist Colonies is located in Kissimmee, Florida, and they have an extensive file on mosquitoes there. But as I understand, you've got to be naked to go in the place, and I'm still reluctant to be known as the naked historian. So I'm working on genetically modified mosquitoes, what's happening in Key West. But if any of you, subscribers to the Florida Humanities Council want to take your clothes off, want to learn about mosquitoes, there is an opportunity in Kissimmee. It's not only the mouse that's there, there's also apparently some nudist colonies as well. So I don't have anything else. I thank you very much, Alex, for organizing this. I want to thank the people who sat through this, my friends who joined in. I want to say again, in my career, I have never encountered a group of individuals as hardworking, as intelligent, and as concerned about the public welfare as the people who are in organized mosquito control. In my decades of research, they have opened their laboratories to me. They've let me look at their files. They've never, ever attempted to in any way restrict my eyesight. And I am in awe and respect of the work they do. We have a difficult time that we live in, but one thing is certain. We will lead mosquito control. There are vector-borne diseases out there. They are waiting. The mosquitoes are there. And all of us need to remember to fight the bite. Fight the bite. So thank you all very much. Again, it's been an honor and pleasure to spend a bit of a Wednesday evening with you. All the best.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. And thank you all for tuning in. And we hope to see you next week. Have a great rest of your evening.